Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're going to be talking about the new triple album from Rae Sremmurd, Shrem. I know what all of you want me to do in this review. You're all waiting for the seething anger, the extended rant on the vapid nonsense that this duo passes off as party bangers, how both their previous records have been among some of the worst hip-hop to be released in the 2010s, and yet I can't do it this time, folks. I'm sorry. Look, I don't regret anything I said about either Shrem Life 1 or 2. They're both bad albums crippled by grating lead performances, awful lyrics, and production that wants to substitute overweight, murky lumps courtesy of Mike Will Made It for anything fun or with significant force. And look, I've got nothing against party bangers, but when you can't match even mid-tier crunk from the 2000s, you've got some serious problems. But then, Black Beatles, unquestionably the best song that Rae Sremmurd has ever made, it became a #1 hit. And then I started hearing Swae Lee refine his cracking nasal delivery into something that's a little smoother, and Slim Jxmmi add a little bit more structure to his bars. And I came to the realization that I might have actually been a shade too hard on Shrem Life 2. It's still pretty bad, especially the extended version, but there were some improvements that might have deserved more attention. I can say that. So okay, maybe the follow-up could rise to being passable, I told myself. Maybe these kids had something in them. And yet, instead of doubling down on a tight record of bangers, which they probably could do halfway decently, they decided a good idea was a triple album. Now, I've said in the past, even double albums can be a dicey proposition, but 3 records from this duo, one from them together and one from each of them solo, called Swaecation and JXMTRO respectively, it's a sort of overstuffed choice where I can count the number of times it has worked in the history of recorded music outside of live albums and greatest hits collections on maybe 2 hands. Seriously, we've got Joanna Newsom, Smashing Pumpkins, Kamasi Washington, maybe the Magnetic Fields or Swans or Prince. It just screams of Rae Sremmurd overplaying their hand, or at the very least misunderstanding their appeal to try this. And yet, my patrons, of course, they wanted to put me through this, so alright, fine. What did we get on Shrem? Well, folks, I need to be very blunt with you right out of the gate. If it wasn't for the fact that I've got something of an infamous history with Rae Sremmurd on this channel, this would have gone on the trailing edge in a heartbeat. And that's the frustrating thing. When you have records as bad as the first 2 Shrem Life albums were, and I stand by that, those are not good albums, but they at least inspired an interesting conversation, or they had a certain amount of flair where even if I couldn't stand them, I get why people liked them. I get why they got some measure of critical acclaim in some sectors. But trudging through the triple album of Shrem and seeing the muted popular reception, I can't help but feel that even though the duo does actually improve a bit again on a technical level, they've lost some of that exuberance and firepower to make even their bad music interesting, exacerbated by overextending themselves on 3 discs. So, in short, yeah, this isn't good, but you knew that from me, and the reasons are very different this time around, and they say some really bleak things about Rae Sremmurd's success long-term, and that's not a good sign. And for starters, I'm going to change up my format when talking about this project, because anybody who has listened to this triple album front to back, you've got my sympathies, but you'll emphatically agree that this should not be bundled together as one cohesive piece. To some extent, each individual disc stands alone in its tone and approach, and thus I'm kind of going to review it as such. So let's start off with the duo disc, Shrem, easily the most distinct of the 3 in both in the best and the worst songs. Now, one thing that becomes abundantly apparent is that Rae Sremmurd, they absolutely need each other for contrast on these songs, if only to cultivate a feedback loop of vapid flexing that allows Slim Jxmmi's more competently structured flow to play off Swae Lee's more melodic singing, which, yes, has gotten better, and all of it's got more auto-tune than it really should have, but again, it's to be expected with this sort of production. But if this disc has any strengths in highlighting that chemistry as well as the best hooks they've got by far, I mentioned in my lyrical issues with both Close and Powerglide on Billboard Breakdown, but you know what, especially the latter, it's got some pretty sweet production, and if it wasn't for Juicy J's verse, that song would probably be close to their best. But I'm sorry, Shrem is also prophetic in showing them at their worst. And by far the weakest track for me here is Buckets. Incredibly lazy hook, Future phoning in his verse again against a lot of ugly dissonant synthesizers, along with some of the most amateurish rapping on the entire album. But you know what? It at least shows Rae Sremmurd in a familiar, rather excruciating lane for me. What proved to be a little bit more of a problem for the duo is a more competent song like Bedtime Stories with the Weeknd, with its bright 90s inspired keyboards and clapping percussion, which in my my opinion, is a better track, but even though he just has the hook, The Weeknd just runs away with the song in terms of poise and quality and charisma in comparison to all the clumsy auto-tune attests, especially for Swae Lee. And that's when the production's actually good. From Buckets to 42 to Teed Up, many of these songs sound like the bass-boosted versions of themselves that do nothing to accentuate the intensity of any sort of hook. And then you get songs like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that actually does bring in a guitar, but gives it no body against the chiptune elements all around it and the heavier beat. And Rae Sremmurd make more wrestling references on that song than more of rock artists. And you know what? That still bugs me. I know I'm not supposed to care about the lyrics, but yeah, it's annoying there. But hey, everybody, including myself, was pegging Swae Lee as the member of Rae Sremmurd who's evolved the most in the past couple of years. So what about his solo disc, Swaecation? Well, like with Shrem, he's overtaken by his guest star, Young Thug on Offshore, even despite not really saying much on that verse. But not really saying much might as well be the tagline for both solo discs, this one especially. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mind the somewhat slinky 80s-inspired synthesizers that add some slick groove to touchscreen navigation or Lost Angels or Hurt to Look, but minus his brother, Swae Lee is left struggling to fill time against these languid guitar-accented tropical percussion that's too desaturated to punch and too lethargic to get all that interesting. It's really a boring disc. Now, of course, it doesn't help matters that most of these songs have him trying to take some other guy's girl, but every layer of auto-tune and faded guitar sounds like a bargain barrel version of what Frank Ocean did better 2 years ago. And there's no convincing verse or intensity or even verve to these songs to help Swae Lee feel like more than just a pale shadow of his obvious influences. I mean, at best, I can see this disc capturing a sort of half-drunk realization of stark loneliness, but even that's not enough to make these songs not feel like pale facsimiles of more developed or interesting songs or artists across the board. Hell, Guatemala is brazen in how much it's just a weaker copy of Unforgettable, and a lot of Swaecation falls in that lane. So alright, fine. Swae Lee delivered a listless bore of a solo project. What about his brother Slim Jxmmi, who nobody expected would succeed? Well, here's the thing. That statement's only half right, because I was expecting to dislike JXMTRO a far bit more than I actually do. Now, many folks have given Swae Lee credit for evolving more as an expressive performer, but Slim Jxmmi has become a slightly better rapper, at least on a technical level. And while there are flubbed rhymes all over this project, there are less outright embarrassing or awful lines, and he can at least bring a little bit more intensity really across all three discs. Although, more often than not, he sounds like he's out of breath or his voice is just dying mid-flow. And you know what? It helps that JXMTRO is one of the more streamlined releases. It goes down pretty easy. But like with Swae Lee, he's shown up again by his guest stars. Riff 3X against the gurgling ugliness of juggling biddies. Pharrell on Chanel once he gets away from that oddly flamboyant falsetto he's trying that didn't flatter anything. And especially Zoe Kravitz on Antisocial Smokers Club, who shows up with more charisma than what's shown on over half this triple album. And if there's a disc where the production has not evolved and sounds cheaper than ever, it's probably JXMTRO. The horribly mixed pianos on Players Club, the gross sounding synthesizers against the overblown bass on Cap, the really cheap trap percussion really all over the disc where the bass beats are too heavy and rarely provide enough groove, which is one thing that at least Swaecation got right. And even the bizarre choice to bring in guitars beneath the trap vibe on Changed Up or Keep God First. And those two songs are where Slim Jxmmi tries to add a little bit more meat to his bars and get a little more interesting. He's more nakedly antagonistic on people encroaching on his space on JXMTRO, but he tries to add some context for why he's hustling for all that money. And yet, I'm sorry, it's so basic and lacking any sort of detail that he tries to infuse into his flexing that it's hard not to feel like he's just added his own depth, lost for contrast or spark without Swae Lee opposite him. But here's the ugly truth. Even together, Swae Lee and Slim Jxmmi don't have enough content to fill an EP here, shallow or otherwise. They're really even bringing the intensity or energy to distract from it. The yowling off-key shouts of the previous two records might have been annoying to me, but there was at least a sense of urgency that could have made for the empty flexing somewhat fun to their target audience. It never worked for me, but I could see where it could have worked for some people. But this, I'm sorry, cut it down to a single record and not feel like a cheap, undercooked attempt to troll for streams, and I'm not sure it would have been good, but it could have at least been passable. But the solo discs leave both artists sounding lost and painfully aware of their limitations, and yet together they're either let down or shown up by their guest stars, or they're crippled by some really ugly production which hasn't gotten a lot better and sounds way too cheap for a group at this magnitude. And when you have to sit through over an hour and a half of this, again, I'm sorry, the anger is gone from me, as it's hard not to feel like this is an overextension into Peep Trap that means their 15 minutes of fame are just about up. And as for me, first disc gets a light 4 out of 10, both solo discs get 3 out of 10, and that rounds out to this getting a strong 3 out of 10 overall. And even if you're a fan of Rae Sremmurd, I can imagine you'll probably think this is just too much all in one place. So I'd pick the cuts or the disc that really works for you and just walk away. Hopefully, be for the best. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know you're probably expecting me to get angry here, but after you go through this disc multiple times and it's over an hour and a half, you just feel kind of sad for these guys, because I honestly think the management may have screwed them up here trying to package all this together. You market this in like solo EPs and maybe just Shrem all by itself. This wouldn't have been good, at least for me, but I could see it having a better marketing chance, and that's a little disappointing. Again, these are kids, and I kind of feel bad that they got screwed with this. But hey, you want to buy it? Links down there below. Polls up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am, like always. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there. Where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier patrons, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule, or you just voting to make sure this gets covered earlier rather than later. If you want to see that schedule, it's on my Instagram, link below. Also keep in mind I've changed my Patreon structure from a per video to a per month stasis so you can get more for your buck. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.